Alright, so let's start with the rares and mythics. When I reviewed them, my first reaction was not great. Because this wasn't one of those pools where you instantly goes and oh yeah, I got this, I know where to go. This honestly wasn't what we were hoping to see. Yes, we were seeing two elemental right away that looked pretty good, but we were also seeing an elf, we were also seeing a goblin, we also seeing a merfolk, and we are also seeing a fairy. So it was pretty easy to notice that the rare and mythics wouldn't give us the archetype. So our first big decision in this tournament would be which archetype we're gonna build around. In Lorwyn Eclipsed, understanding different archetypes matter a lot, because the Kindred synergies can snowball real fast. You can play with Goblins, Elves, Merfolk, Kithkin, and even other archetypes. And we'll definitely bring more details about those other archetype strategies in future videos. In a different sealed draft I played earlier, same format, at that point of the game when I opened my rares and mythics, Merfolk was a total no-brainer. The pool basically solved itself, and the archetype was obvious from the start. This pool wasn't like that. When I opened these rares, I saw multiple directions we could go. There were goblins, elves, fairies, merfolks, and none of them clearly screamed, this is the direction. So we moved to our commons and uncommons. And at that point, the commons and uncommons start to show more clarity than the rares. And as I'm going through them, things slowly start to clear up. Elementals keep showing up, synergies starting lining up, and that's when the pool starts talking back a little. There's still a question in the back of my mind though. Do we splash white? I mean, two of the mythical cards we got in these boosters, they were white. And on top of that, one is even an elemental. But that would require at least two planes being added, which at that point didn't make too much sense in my mind and could be too risky. Keep in mind that this is still our first week playing Lorwyn Eclipsed at this point, and we haven't played much with these cards and synergies yet. I consider at that point that would make more sense to get to know the bread and butter of this deck first, before stretching the mana pool. A decision I would regret later, and you will see why. Game 1 started, and right from the beginning, I could see that in the other side, it was a well-planned deck that explored well its combos and synergies right from the get-go. Cards like Bogart Mischief and Bogart Cursecrafter weren't individually overpowering, but together, with his other spells, they created constant pressure and momentum. Even though I managed to stabilize and push the game late, that synergy engine kept working every turn, as every time one of their creature died, he gets life and I lose even more life. And that's where the weakness showed up. I could survive, but I couldn't turn the corner yet. That matchup ends up being very important because it starts revealing a pattern. This Elementals build has good blocking, lets you draw cards and prolong the game, have good triggers to generate mana and sun damage. But with these cards, didn't look like I had enough bombs and punches to throw yet. So I had to go back and review my decisions. The deck really needed more powerful cards for late in the game. So this time I decided to splash white, hoping to play our mythics, Eirdu and Morningtide's Light. Also made a few tweaks on the cards and made important adjustments for game 2. I was really curious and looking forward to seeing how the deck would go now with these updates. In game 2, proves that decision of making some effort to play our mythics was right, in the best way possible. This time, I'm up against Elves, and at the start of the game, immediately tells me what kind of match this is going to be. I got a relatively fast start for an elemental deck, but my opponent quickly dropped a Druid and some Elves, which shuts down early ship damage, and follows it up with a Creekwood Safe Ride. At that moment, I'm thinking, oh no. Because Elves is one of the best archetypes on this set. The graveyard synergies are no joke, and honestly, this deck deserves a full video of its own at some point. If you would like to see a full breakdown of Elves in Lorwyn Eclipsed, let me know in the comments. Right in the beginning of the game, I want you to pay attention to this early decision that will matter later. I used Kurath Zealot for land cycling and to find a copy of planes that we needed. This is a mechanic we've seen recently in Final Fantasy, and it's still present here in Lorwyn Eclipsed. At the time, it helped me a lot with finding that specific land. But remember this play, because we will come back to it later. The early game continues with a key piece on my side, the Dawn Blessed Pennant. This card does a lot of quiet work. It gives me 1 life for every elemental I cast, and later I can sacrifice it to return an elemental from my graveyard to my hand. That second line is going to matter later. I also find 2 Eclipsed Flameskins, which help me hit land drops and keep the game moving. When I'm looking at my opponent's side, things are getting scarier fast. Not 1, but he already added 2 Creekwood safe rights. And here's a part that I really want you to pay attention to. From now on, I'll be extremely careful to not let elves go to my opponent's graveyard. That is not easy when you're playing against elves. Watch how I block and how I only block with 1 Eclipsed Flameskin. If I blocked with both, it would have looked great at first. His creature dies, but that would put an elf into his graveyard. And from that point on, the safe rights would start snowballing with -1/-1 counters off every turn. He's trying to sacrifice 1 to grow the other, and for several turns, I deliberately prevent that from happening. That single blocking decision ends up shaping a lot of this entire game. In mid-game, one thing that really helped me is that I was able to find a Blossom Bind. And that helped me by permanently tapping his Twilight Diviner. He kept attacking me, and I kept blocking. I was able to get Flame Braider in, and that is important because it generates 2 mana that I can cast elemental spells or activating elemental abilities, which our deck is loaded with. He then found an Iron Shield Elf, which is an important card for the Elf deck because it gets indestructible as he discards a card. But fortunately, I was able to find and use another Blossom Bind on his Iron Shield Elf. He kept finding interesting elves with his Eclipsed Elf, but my deck was being able to hold on and not help his synergies by sending elves to the graveyard. I was able to play an Enraged Flamecaster, and that is an important asset on your elemental deck, because it causes 2 damage every time you cast a spell with 4 mana or greater. And also have reach, which doesn't matter that much versus elves, but is also worth mentioning as you are planning your elementals deck. This card was so great and important for our future victories that it is the thumbnail of this video. As we moved to a more late stage of the game, as we both already had 6 lands in play, I was able to get my Twin Flame Travelers in. And that was the first time in this game I had a creature with flying to be able to draw some damage each turn. And much more than that, now all the triggered abilities from my elementals would trigger an additional time. And of course, got the 2 damage in from the Enraged Flamecaster. Unfortunately, on his turn, my opponent cast a Bogslither's Embrace and was able to exile my Twin Flame Travelers, so I didn't actually got to attack with flying or get those additional triggers. But remember early game when I told you to keep in mind that I was just land cycling my Kulrath Zealot for now? That is because while opponent was getting rid of my Twin Flame Travelers, I made the decision of sacrificing my Dawn Blessed Pennant, using its second ability to bring back my Kulrath Zealot to my hand. Then, in my turn, I was able to put it in play and started to see more attack power accumulated on my side. But more than that, the draw for that hand was perfect and proved our point about thinking on late game with elementals, and also about splashing white after our first game experiment, as I draw a Morningtide's Light, which ended up being the deciding factor we needed in this match. But at first, I will admit that I didn't fully understand how great this card really is. When I first read it, I thought it was something just to protect my creatures, or maybe getting them back in game untapped after attacking. So I didn't use it yet, and kept getting elementals in play. Flame King Guildweaver is another interesting mid-play one to have in mind when planning your elementals deck. It's 4 mana for 4/3, but it has trample, and creates a treasure token when enters. Opponent had 1 more turn to try to do something, but during that turn, I was rereading the Morningtide's Light and had an eureka moment. I can actually use it to take his creatures out during my attack, so he has no blocks and I win the game. Of course, I didn't have to worry with the 2 that were already with Blossom Bind, But watch how beautiful it was. What a nice combo, huh? Elementals for the win. He's conceding. Nice. This match was a perfect example of the importance of making those decisions that we did and optimizing on what we learned from our first match. Game 3 was interesting from the very start. We had a fast start with the Soulbright Seeker. He costs 1 red mana and behold 1 elemental. He's a 2/1 and for 1 red mana gives trample to a creature. And if you use this ability 3 times, you get 4 red manas on top that you can use too. On his first turn, he just played an Eclipsed Realm and chose Elemental as well. So that was already an indication of what was to come. Because early on, I started recognizing cards. We actually found an opponent that used similar cards to us, but as the game evolves, you'll see he actually had a different spin on it. On my round 2, I played Flame Chain Mauler, and I was happy because I played a card on both initial rounds, and he only won. A common recurring theme here at No Mulligan is that Magic the Gathering is a game about managing your resources and making wise decisions. And a great example of that is the famous mana curve. Basically, you want to have cards to play in all the stages of the game. You don't want to have to wait too much because your opponent could come and end the game right away, but you also don't want to use all your cards in the beginning and then not have powerful cards to play in the end of the game. We will do a more detailed video diving deeper on that subject, showing practical examples, even a formula that will help you make that happen. If that is the kind of content you want to see here, let me know in the comment. And also subscribe to the channel to make sure you see when that video is out. But back to our game here. On round 3, I played the Gangly Stompling, a changeling 3 mana that is 4/2 and trample. And then I thought, I will attack with both because I'm interested in trading with these Flame Chain Maulers. And he did block that way. And on his turn, he also played a Gangly Stompling. Then I decided to attack and I thought he would want to block and trade our Stompers too. But to my surprise, he didn't block. The next turn, he did something that was one of my favorite memories of this game. He played an Explosive Prodigy. And because of the Vivid ability, maximized by the fact that he kept his Stompling in play on the previous round, he was able to cause damage to one of my creatures. I was worried initially because I thought he was going to get my Flame Braider, which was acting as a mana source for me to put the Kurath Zealot in play soon. Getting the Zealot in turn 5 would be a very nice move. To my surprise, he actually targeted my Stompling. I think he didn't realize I could use that mana source to bring something even more powerful. And then, right away, he played Cinder Strike. And for a moment, I was, okay, alright, my combo is gone now. But then he targeted the Mauler, leaving the way open for me to cast the Zealot in the next turn. Do you see how that decision is helping to shape the game? If he targeted my Flame Braider, that would slow me down at least 1 round, maybe even 2. But I was able to finally play the Zealot on the next round. But unfortunately, on his turn, he played Feed the Flames and got rid of my Zealot. And then we got once more on that situation of playing the same card, because I also had a Feed the Flames in my hand and I decided to burn his Stompling. Now on his turn, he was able to get a Giant in play, in Brambleback Brute. And in my turn, I draw Thirst for Identity, which allowed me to buy 3 more cards, but left with a hard decision to make. Which card should I discard now? I ended up discarding Ashling because I knew the Eclipsed Flame Skin could help me to find a nice card that could make a difference in the late game. And also the Enraged Flamecaster, because it's an amazing card that's even on the thumbnail of this video. But also because those 2 damage every time I play an expensive spell could decide the game, since he was already at 8 life and I still had 20. And in his turn, he did it once again, played a card same as mine, and also got an Enraged Flamecaster on his side as well. My draw now was a good one, because it was the Draw Blasted Pennant that we saw in the previous game. So I knew that could help me bring back the Zealot he just Feed the Flamed a couple rounds ago. But the payoff was even better than expected, since while using the Zealot's ability, I ended up finding one of our Miracles. The Eirdu. Eirdu is one of the main bombs on this deck that comes late game for a final punch to decide the game. It's a white legendary creature 5/5 with flying and lifelink. It also adds Convoke to your creatures, but sometimes that doesn't make that much of a difference late in the game. It's also a two-side card, but for our elemental set here, that is rare to use, since you need a swamp, and our source of swamp is limited to very few resources here. So, at this point, I was pretty sure that even if the Zealot, Enraged Flamecaster, or even my other creatures wouldn't do it, the Eirdu would be able to come and finish the game. That series of plays gave me even more security in attacking with the Zealot now, since he only had 4 life and would have to block it. I calculated that he could block and kill my Zealot, but still was worth to see him losing some creatures, and now I knew I would be able to bring it back with the Pennant. I knew he had 1 card, and depending of what it was, I could be able to win the game right there. But turns out he had a very interesting card to play for what he needed. He double blocked with his Flamecaster and also his Squawk Roaster, which has double strike. But on top of that, he played a card that turned out to be great for what he needed on that situation. It's a Selfless Safe Ride, which is a green creature with Flash and Convoke that when it gets into play, lets you choose a creature type, which is very convenient in Lorwyn Eclipsed with all the Kindred synergies you can play. And all those creatures get hexproof and indestructible until the end of the turn. That was a great play on opponent's side. But fortunately, this game was almost in our hands. I was still able to use the Blessed Pennant to get the Zealot back to my hand as planned, and in the following turn, I was able to take 2 more life, leaving him at 2. And to my surprise, I found an Omnight Changeling while using the Zealot's ability. The Omnight Changeling is a blue 5 mana Changeling. It's all creatures, so it's elemental, of course. With Convoke, and enters as copy of any creature. You just have to be careful late game to not choose a legendary creature. So in my case, I couldn't choose Eirdu, because I would have to sacrifice one of them. And because it's elemental, because it's changeling, I was able to use my Flame Braider to cast it right away. And since it's 5 mana, the Enraged Flamecaster dealt the 2 damage and killed my opponent right on the spot. But if he had more life, I still had the Eirdu and 2 Zealots to keep playing. That was definitely another game, confirming that splashing the white was a very important decision. That changed the course of the Sealed tournament for us, and made it a lot more fun and profitable. That decision saved our run in this Lorwyn Eclipsed tournament. So, we are excited with our momentum. We got 2 victories after optimizing our deck, and then we're ready to see our next game. But then, game 4 was, well, let's just say it was short. And honestly, we never really had a chance. We ran straight into Merfolk. This was one of those games where the engine turns on early, the tempo never lets go, and Merfolk does what Merfolk does best. It takes your blockers away. Between tapping effects, bounce, and evasive pressure, our plan to stabilize and go long never even got off the ground. And that's actually an important lesson here. This Elementals build, especially with the White Splash, proved that it can grind, generate value, and close game when it's allowed to block and reach the late game. But this Merfolk set is built to deny that. It doesn't matter how strong your late game is if you never get there in the first place. That's not a deck building mistake, that's a metagame reality. And that's exactly why understanding opposing archetypes matter just as much as understanding your own deck, especially here in Lorwyn Eclipse. We'll definitely do a full Merfolk breakdown in the future, because this matchup explains a lot about how this archetype really works when it's at its best. After that shock of reality, we turn our attention to Game 5. And Game 5 was a lot of fun, which honestly was needed after our Merfolk debacle. We faced Kithkin, one of the popular archetypes in the format. And this was exactly the kind of matchup our deck wanted. They play fair creatures, they want to attack and block, and when that happens, elementals can stabilize and eventually overpower the board. This match was a good reminder that the deck does work, and works very well against decks that don't mess with your blockers or your tempo. That's it, a clean win, and we move on. Now, Game 6 is on, and it's our last chance to survive here. But don't forget that after this, we're still going to break down the strengths and weaknesses of this deck and give it a final overall grade. Unfortunately, Game 6 was another loss to Merfolk. But this one at least taught an extra lesson. This wasn't just pure Merfolk. This version also had Giants at the top end, and then Omni Changeling to glue everything together. The Merfolk core still did what it does best. It removed blockers, bounced threats, and controlled tempo. But now, when the game went long, they also had size because of the giant. So even the plan of surviving and outscale didn't work this time. This matchup really shows the ceiling of Merfolk in this format, especially when it's built with hybrid payoffs and changeling support. It can be very powerful. After the Sealed Draft tournament is over, now it's time for us to go back and draw some conclusions we learned through this experience. So we're gonna highlight some strengths and weaknesses that we observed in this Elementals deck. Let's start with some strengths. There were a lot of fun moments playing with this Elemental deck, especially in the late game. Once we splashed white, this deck had real closing power. Cards like Eirdu, Carrier of Dawn, and Morningtide's Light, and repeatable elemental value meant that if the game went long, we were favored many times. I also thought this deck has an interesting value engine. Between elemental synergies, mana generation with Flame Braider, recursion and gaining life with the Dawnblessed Pennant, and even card selection from cards like the Eclipsed Flameskin, the deck could grind very well, recover from interaction, and get us cards and resources as we advanced in the game. I also thought that this deck did well against popular archetypes like Elves and Kithkin, decks that has good synergies and want to play creatures and interact on the board. This build could block, stabilize the game, and eventually overpower them. And it was really nice seeing this deck delivering strong punches against these popular archetypes. Now, let's go over some weaknesses that we observed in this deck. I thought the Achilles heel of this deck is the synergy pressure, especially through certain archetypes. It performed really bad versus Merfolk, and also that first game against the Goblins exposed the biggest weakness here. When opponents could apply early pressure and keep our blockers off the board, our late game plan didn't get enough time to matter. Also, this deck didn't always punish opponents early. When games ended quickly or snowballed out of control, we didn't have many ways to reset the board or steal back tempo. And also the deck's not fast enough to finish the game in a couple rounds. So that exposes a vulnerability on this deck, especially against specific archetypes. The deck was very strong in the right matchups, but clearly unfavored in others. That puts it just below true A tier of decks that can complete all around. With all those things considered, I give this deck a B+. The white splash absolutely elevated the deck and helped us to get some nice wins. But for the format, especially with Kindred synergies like Merfolk and Goblins, understanding archetypes, matchups, and how your deck actually wins, the adjustments necessary to optimize it, is just as important as picking strong cards. And hopefully, that's what this experience is helping us to do. If you like this format of video, let me know in the comments. This was an experiment in breaking down a sealed draft tournament run through decisions, matchups, and archetypes, not just the gameplay. So I would love to hear what worked for you and what you would like to see improved. And if you want more content like this, subscribe and keep watching here on No Mulligan.